Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of LaKesha and Friends. And I'm so happy to have my new friend, Reverend Carlton Worthen, on with us today to talk about voting. Um, Interestingly, Reverend Carlton is in Alabama, where I am originally from, and he is in a small town, which is where I grew up. So I know a lot about the context of where he is. And so I was really excited to have this conversation just to hear what's happening in Alabama in 2020 in the voting cycle. So, Reverend Carlton, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hello. First of all, I want to extend a sincere and heartfelt thanks to you. I almost want to go ahead and just say Reverend Womack,
I am a Reverend.
but sometimes people don't always want to hold on to their titles per se. But no, with you being a woman of God who is most definitely also helping to advance the kingdom through civic engagement as well. Thank you so much for being that brave person to go ahead and create this platform where we can have this type of dialogue. I'm originally from Tallahassee, Florida, the state capital of Florida. And of course, my math is a little bit better than some of the people down there in Florida. If we think back to the 2000 presidential election, where we had the results hanging in limbo for several weeks on end. I'm a political science major from the great Florida A&M University, located on the highest of seven hills. So to all of my rattlers out there, strike, 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 strike again. But then after graduating from Florida A&M, had a brief stint with corporate America as a drug rep for the Johnson and Johnson Corporation, the subsidiary Ortho McNeil Neurologics. And then while in corporate America is when I answered my call to ministry. For as good as corporate America was to me, it was not fulfilling. Is when I began to fulfill the tugging to walk away from that, to give it all up, and entered into seminary after answering the call to ministry. And I'm now pastoring my second church. The first church I pastored was Bethel AME Church in Barnesville, Georgia, about a good hour south of Atlanta. And now I currently serve as the pastor of St. John AME Church here in the metropolitan city of a population of less than 30,000, Eufaula, Alabama, in the Ninth Episcopal District, where my servant bishop is none other than Bishop Harry Lee Seawright. So that's just kind of an overview right there of how I've also ended up here in Alabama.
Awesome. But in there, you've also done some work with some politicians or in some government spaces as well, right?
Absolutely. It's an interesting way how I even became introduced to politics and getting involved in the process of how public policy is shaped and formed. I have to give credit to my history teacher from high school, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Goldfarb, who asked me if I was interested in being able to have a few days out of school and to get paid for it. Well, sign me up. You mean I can get out of school and get paid as well? Became a Senate page in Tallahassee at the state capitol. And that was a defining moment right there that forever shaped and formed my life to be interested in politics. And of course, after that, it went on to work on Congressman Alan Boyd's campaign, who's a congressman from Tallahassee, former congressman from Tallahassee, have worked on two mayoral campaigns in Tallahassee as well. Dorothy, and her name at that time was Dorothy Inman Cruz. It's now Dorothy Inman Johnson, as well as City Commissioner Cliff Thale. So have worked on a few campaigns, know a little something about how to move the needle.
And I think that that's very interesting because you don't find a lot of African Americans who work in as Senate pages or who actually work in the actual, what do you call it? Not the House of Representatives, but the state houses. Like you don't find a
Mhm.
lot of young African Americans in those positions. What would you say is like a good reason for them to seek out those types of opportunities?
Now, when you say seek, are you referring to black males, black people? What
Yeah,
do you
just
mean when
I
you
think
say
just
seek out?
minorities in general, because like normally when I've gone to whether it's lobbying like my state capital or going to DC, like you mostly see white people working in those positions, and you don't see a lot of minorities. And as you said, like it
Mhm.
kind of struck the match for you, like why you should be involved. So, what would you say to encourage more young people to seek those types of opportunities?
Right. Right. Well. First of all, I would say that, and I'm sure we've heard this many times before, so I do not mean this in a cliche type of way, but oftentimes policy that has the most direct impact on many of us is decided at the local and state level.
Right,
So we cannot run over that. When you begin to look at the types of policies that are shaped and formed at the state level, it has a tremendous impact on our schools. It has a tremendous impact on if you reside in a state that has a state income tax. Now, Florida, fortunately, is one of the few states, with the exception, I believe, of Texas and Tennessee, that does not have a state income tax. But again, it's decided at that level. You also have a lot of business regulation. So, for many of you who may be entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs, do not overlook the impact that state government and even your local government has on your business as well, particularly when it comes to things such as zoning issues, when it
right,
comes to how regulations are shaped and formed. So, it's very, very important. Then, what's often decided at the state level are various guidelines for how different industries will work. So, for example, what may be medically acceptable in one state may not be an accepted medical best practice in another state. So it's a whole plethora of different things that's decided at the state as well as the local level. I
right.
don't
And
know if I answered your question or not.
yes, it definitely did because that's one of the, I guess, goals of this series is to help people to understand the impact that voting has. Because so often we place a premium on voting for the next president, and like that's the big election. But as you said, these state elections and your local elections affect your life directly more often than the national elections. So tell us a little bit, because one of the things that we were talking about as we were waiting to go live, you were saying like how organizing campaigns and working in the campaign world is very similar to the ministry world. Talk a little bit about that because I think a lot of times people think like, oh, I don't want to work on a campaign or I don't want to get involved because it's like this whole foreign entity. But share a little bit about how you see the similarities between the two.
Oftentimes, after now having pastored for a number of years, I often share with individuals in a joking way, and I hope no one takes offense with how I say this for those who are politically correct.
Right.
But pastoring is about knowing how to manage relationships and
Mhm.
personalities. Um, Oftentimes, the pastor, many of the people whom that pastor has to lead and shepherd and sometimes chastise in a loving way are some of the same people that will come right back around, watch this, and decide what your salary may be.
Right.
You do not see that happen oftentimes in corporate America or in the private sector or even in the government sector to that extent. I also often share with people another one of the similarities that you see is with the managing of the personalities is working directly with people and watch this, trying to identify what is it that really moves and motivates them,
Mm,
not to be manipulative. But remember, when you are an elected official, in an ideal world, it's not about you per se, but it's about you being able to tap in and to act in the best interest on those whom you are sent to represent at City Hall, the State House, or of course at the Congress or even in the White House. And so when you look at ministry, you have to learn as pastor, it's not all about what you want, but it's also about how do I minister to this young lady who has just been laid off of her job and she's a single mother? Or how do I minister to this young man who may have some felonies on his record and is having a difficult and challenging time with landing a job? Let alone get an interview. How do you minister to to this elderly person who has done everything the right way, worked hard, saved his or her money down through the years, but now has come to find out that what they thought they were going to have access to in their golden years is not quite what it was. And yet you still have to minister and pastor them. But then on the flip side of that coin, I often times hear conversations about the millennials and what's the new generation now right behind the millennials?
Like Gen Z.
Generation Z.
So,
And, you know, I oftentimes have to remind them, listen, you may be the millennial now, the Generation Z, but one day you're going to become the age of those who are the baby boomers right now. So we can't always just do things the way that you want things to be done, but we have to keep in mind what is best for the greater good.
right.
And so when we look at those similarities between pastoring and the church and political campaigns, you see a lot of parallels. One of the parallels, of course, is managing relationships, working within small groups, crafting messages, what we in the political world, what's political sphere may say messaging. How do you create messaging that really sticks? It's the economy, stupid. Yes, we can build that wall, make America great again. These are all messages that a lot of thought and time go into so that it can become embedded in people's mindset. And then, of course, with the building of coalitions, let me tell you something. For any person who has ever pastored or served in any capacity in ministry, if you think you're going to do it by yourself, and not need the help of others, not only within the four walls of the church, but also outside of the four walls of the church, you're sadly mistaken. So goes the same for a political campaign. If you think you're going to get elected just by you yourself, and you're not going to need the help of others, again, you're sadly mistaken. So there are a lot of parallels. I could go on and on and on and on about many
That's,
of the
that's
parallels.
yeah, I think that that's interesting because I didn't really think about those parallels, but I think that may be why a lot of times community leaders look to pastors to help
Mhm.
organize and to help, get their message out once it's been crafted, because pastors do have that skill set kind of ingrained in them through the pastoring. I do want to shift gears a little bit because I'm so curious. Living in
Sure.
Alabama, coming from Florida, living in a small town in Alabama, and knowing that Alabama is a red state and can have
Mhm.
some very conservative views. What are you hearing from people around like the election and how like they're internalizing everything that's happening right now?
Well, let me say this. First of all, when I moved to Eufaula, I came here. I'm from Atlanta, but when I moved here to the Eufaula, I often share with people the movie My Cousin Vinny, and that was definitely my experience first coming here. It was a total culture shock.
Yeah.
Um, for those who may not be aware of where Eufaula is, it is in the rural South. We are literally kissing the Georgia line. I am literally less than a 5-minute drive from the Georgia state line. There are cotton fields that's less than a 10-minute drive away from my home. Where I currently reside, there are literally mansions that go up and down the road that were built by slaves that people still live in. So that stereotype that you may have about Alabama as far as the geography is where I am living now. Um, in many ways, living in a small community definitely has its pluses, but it also has quite a few setbacks, as you yourself have even shared growing up in a small rural Alabama community. The community where I reside, it's heavily red. These are diehard Republicans, and I don't use the word Republicans. I am accosted by Republicans on every side. And so I feel that I have a mandate by God to constantly remind them that a lot of the policies that they stand for are not of God. And so oftentimes we find ourselves in some very rigorous and robust type conversations. But by and large, on a more serious level, you'll find that many of the people here want a lot of the same things that everybody else wants, with a lot of the political uh, noise that's going on. At the end of the day, we want to make certain that we're able to put food on our tables. We want to make certain that when we go into our homes, that our families are safe, that if we should ever need to call the legal authorities, the police, that there is someone to come to our aid, that defund the police does not necessarily mean to just do completely away with the police. So we all really share a lot in common. And so oftentimes we have to just figure out how do we get to that common ground without there being so much disruption.
So what would you share as one strategy for someone who needs to have like one of those tough discussions? Because a lot of times, especially from like a Christianity perspective, as you said, a lot of the policies that Republicans espouse are not of God, yet they, consider themselves, Christian conservatives and family values. But when you really start to dig into it, it's like, wait, so how do you approach those conversations?
I mean, oftentimes it's just a matter of, first of all, having an open mind and understand that many of us, nearly all of us, we are shaped by our life's experiences. We are shaped by what we have been exposed to or what we have not been exposed to.
Right.
So sometimes that common ground question can be as simple as this. Reverend Womack, you have an interesting perspective or you have an interesting stand. You mind sharing with me what led you to that?
Oh, that's
And
good.
then just take a step back and close your mouth and just listen. And then as you begin to listen, begin to identify some of the commonalities that you and the individual whom you're speaking with or talking with have in common, and then begin to build from there. So often we have the mindset that my way is the right way, you
Right.
from the pit of hell and you going back to hell. And so for all of the Republicans that we as Democrats are trying to cast into the pit of hell, they trying to cast us into as Democrats into the pit of hell
Right, right.
as well. But whoa, wait a minute, take a step back
Yeah.
and let's see, what do we have in common? And then as we can identify what we have in common, now let's begin to build a meaningful and genuine relationship.
That's
That's what's worked best for me.
That's good. I like that approach because I think that that's the place where a lot of people find themselves, especially as you said, like tensions are heightened with all of the issues that seem to erupt every day. So it's like, how do you have those conversations in a meaningful way that does not lead to, I guess, like further tension, but that can actually lead to productive conversation. So I promise you, I wasn't
But
going
but now but hold on now. I do want to add though. I do want to add that there is a place and space and time where the difficult conversations must be challenged. And I
to.
oftentimes preach that we like to focus on what I call individual sin. And we totally dismiss and overlook organizational sin and corporate sin.
Ooh.
And so when we look at that, We're living it right now when you look at that 2010 Supreme Court decision, since we now find ourselves thrust into the untimely demise of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg with the Citizens United court case that
Yeah.
the Supreme Court weighed in on. That's corporate sin, where corporations have the ability to just give unlimited monies. And then when we see efforts and attempts to roll back the 1965 Voting Rights Act, again, that's a corporate institutional type sin as well. So yes, we want to find where we can have common ground, but we can't ignore where people are being marginalized and pushed to the side. So I felt that needed to be shared.
Yeah.
Um, lest someone think that I was giving the wink and a nod. You just totally dismiss the other side. No, that's not what I'm saying.
No, I think that that's the perfect balance, but I think that you have to start at the beginning where you are able to find that common ground so that when you do get to the difficult part, then the other party can hear what you're saying. Because too often we jump into the accusations and this is why you're wrong without the other person being able to hear us because we haven't kind of built that relationship, which I guess goes back to the pastoring. Like you really can't pastor people until you have a relationship with them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I promised I wasn't going to keep you, but this is like so good. But what final advice would you give to someone who's, out trying to convince non-voters or people who don't think that their vote matters, or they're in a red state and they're like, oh, it doesn't matter if I vote anyway? Like, what advice do you give to people who are trying to mobilize voters in this season?
Just keep working at it. Understand that everyone is not going to always agree with you, but do not be discouraged. I close out my sermons almost every Sunday with this hymn: be not dismayed, whatever betide, God will take care of you.
Yes.
And what that says to me, and what I would offer to many of you as a word of encouragement, is even when others may give you a deaf ear or turn their back and walk away from the message, the invitation that you're extending to them to get to those polls or to submit their ballot, if they're going to be voting by absentee, your vote matters. It's the one equalizer that we have here in this republic, where everyone who is registered, who's qualified, has the opportunity to cast one vote. And when you fail to do so, what you are electing to do is to not have a voice. And there's an old saying: when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Well, when you fail to vote, you allow others to determine your fate.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we're definitely going to have to continue this conversation because I want to hear more about those parallels that you were talking about, and especially after, this election cycle, because we have to start planning for the next cycle. And just thinking about more ways that we can get churches and congregations involved in the community to organize around voting, not necessarily for a candidate, but just getting people more civically engaged. So you will be back.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. God bless you. God keep you.
Wonderful.